Let's watch the town of Red Creek sign 2 death warrants. They hauled a broken, paralyzed mountain man onto an exhausted widow's porch. Folks figured that brutal frontier winter would swallow them both whole. Just a cruel frontier joke, really. A cheap trick to steal her homestead. But folks out west always misjudge what happens when 2 discarded souls refuse to bleed for everyone else's entertainment. Pull up a chair for Martha and Colm's story. That August heat in Red Creek didn't just bake the prairie, it completely wrung it dry. Martha Higgins stood over her washboard, heavy arms, plunging a worn flannel shirt deep into that gray, lye-thickened water. Bitter sweat gathered in the creases of her neck, pooling down beneath her heavy chest, soaking her calico dress until it clung tight to her stomach. She absolutely despised this heat, along with the stench of boiling dirt and cheap lye soap. But most of all, she hated hearing Amos Higgins rattling his wagon up her dirt drive. Amos was her dead husband's brother, a man who wore sheer cruelty like a tailored Sunday suit. He finally yanked those mules to a halt, iron wheels grinding into the baked frontier dust. Amos spat a thick stream of black tobacco juice right over the wagon side, barely missing Martha's sad little radish patch. "Brought you a present, Martha." His voice scraped the hot air like a rusted iron hinge. Martha didn't quit scrubbing. Her broad shoulders just kept working in a harsh, steady rhythm. "I have no coin for whatever you're peddling, Amos, and I sure ain't selling my farm." "Ain't selling nothing." Amos chuckled, letting out a wet, rattling sound. He stepped down from that buckboard, heavy boots kicking up small clouds of alkali dirt. "Council had a meeting. Decided since you're so lonely out here and built so sturdy, you could do us all a little Christian service." Martha finally stopped. She wiped a sudsy hand across her brow, plastering a wet streak of hair right against her temple. She trudged heavily toward the wagon, her tired knees aching with every single step. When she finally peered over those wooden sideboards, her stomach completely dropped. Down in a bed of rotting, foul-smelling straw lay a man, or what survived of one. Even crumpled like that, the stranger was massive. His legs were wrapped in crude, dirty pine board splints. A rough wool blanket hid his waist, stained pitch black with dried blood and piss. Greasy, matted hair hid most of his weathered face, yet those eyes were still plain as day. They were a pale, washed-out blue of winter ice staring a hole right through her. No fear in that gaze, only a feral, burning kind of humiliation. "Grizzly got him up on the ridge," Amos offered, leaning on the wheel. "Crushed his spine. Doc says he's gone from the waist down. Can't walk, can't work. The settlement won't feed a useless cripple, and the poorhouse is packed. Figured you could use a man around this homestead, Martha. Even half a man." Amos laughed, hard and nasty sound that made Martha want to bust that heavy washboard right over his empty skull. Let's look at this twisted joke together. The town dumped a paralyzed mountain man on a stubborn widow, hoping they'd starve. It would just save the local bank the trouble of foreclosing. She looked down at the wagon. The stench rolling off him was downright staggering. Rotting meat, stale sweat, and creeping infection. He breathed in shallow, ragged gasps. "I cannot take him, Amos," Martha finally said, her voice dead flat, completely missing those tears Amos wanted to see. "I can barely feed myself." "Take him or he goes in the ditch," Amos snapped, his wicked smile vanishing. "Council orders. He's your problem now." Without waiting for a fight, Amos unlatched the heavy tailgate. He grabbed the mountain man by his ragged buckskin shoulders and brutally hauled him backward. The stranger didn't cry out, but a sharp, guttural grunt tore from his throat as ruined legs scraped that rough timber. Amos let go. The mountain man hit the frontier dirt with a sickening thud, thick dust pluming up around him. Amos tipped his hat. "Enjoy the pleasant company, Martha." She stood frozen under that beating sun as the wagon rattled away, leaving her completely alone with a crippled stranger in the dirt. The dead silence of the plains rushed back, broken only by fat horseflies zeroing in on the man's bloody pine splints. Martha stared down at him. He was desperately trying to push up on his elbows, his massive forearms corded with strain. but his lower half stayed completely limp. Just a dead weight pinning him to the earth. He collapsed back into the dry dust, his heavy chest heaving, absolutely refusing to look her way. Let's step onto the harsh frontier together. She felt a bitter, ugly resentment wanting to lock her door and leave him to the hungry coyotes. The woman was bone-tired. So damn sick and tired of tending to things that were already dying. Her late husband crops and dignity. But staring at his heavy jaw and those white-knuckled fists gripping the dusty earth, she recognized the stubborn shape of a man's pride. It looked exactly like hers. "I ain't dragging you," she said, voice rough as sandpaper. The fallen man just grunted. "Didn't ask you to." His voice was a gravelly rasp, dry as a bone-dry riverbed. "Well, you ain't dying in my yard," she muttered. "It'll ruin the grass." Martha marched over her heavy thighs, brushing. She bent down in the dirt, completely ignoring the fiery protest in her lower back. She hooked him under the armpits. His thick coat was stiff with old grease. "Grab my arms," she commanded. He hesitated. Then his massive, calloused hands clamped hard onto her forearms. His grip held a shocking, desperate strength. Martha planted her leather boots, braced her thick core, and hauled. The man was incredibly heavy, a solid, dead weight of bone and muscle. She dragged him backward, step by agonizing step, toward the weathered porch. Salty sweat poured down, stinging her eyes. Her breath came in harsh, ragged huffs. Hitting the porch steps, she finally dropped him for a second, resting hands on her knees to gasp for air. He lay flat on those wooden boards, panting just as hard, staring blindly up at the peeling paint of her porch ceiling. "Name is Martha," she wheezed. "Colm," he grunted out, shutting his eyes. She offered 0 welcoming smiles, and he offered absolutely no gratitude. Out there it was just baking heat, buzzing flies, and the brutal frontier reality of broken flesh they now had to manage. Martha grabbed him under the arms again, hauling his heavy frame over the threshold. Those first 3 days were a pure masterclass in frontier misery. She moved Colm into the tiny parlor, dumping him onto a narrow iron cot she had wrestled down from the dusty attic. The cramped room quickly took on his scent: pine needles, rank fever, sweat, and the sharp, sour tang of soiled linens. Tending to a crippled man was an intimate, ugly business, completely stripped of any dime novel romance. There was absolutely nothing noble about it. Think about that kind of grit for a second. When he needed cleaning, he'd stare at a ceiling crack, jaw locked tight, while Martha grimly did the filthy work with a rag and cold well water. She was never gentle. A lone homesteader doesn't have the spare time or energy to be delicate. She'd roll his heavy, paralyzed torso over with a grunt, thick fingers gripping his hips tight, just to keep him from sliding off that narrow mattress. The man hated it. He hated the fierce indignity, the utter helplessness, and most of all, he hated that this woman was doing it. "You're pulling the skin," he snapped one Tuesday morning, his rough voice low and vibrating with dangerous, repressed rage. Martha just dropped that wet rag into the tin bucket with a heavy splash. "Then grow a new pair of legs and wash yourself, mountain man. Until then, you take the rough lye soap and keep your damn mouth shut." Colm glared daggers at her. His dark eyes, unclouded by the fever that broke the night before, were fierce like a hawk. He tracked her every single move constantly. He watched the way she moved around the cabin, heavy but surprisingly light on her feet. He watched her eat a meager portion of cheap cornmeal mush, scraping the bottom of her battered tin plate to get every last little grain. He noticed the fraying, dirt-stained hem of her dress, the bruised bags under her eyes. He fully expected pity. Up in the brutal mountains, if a wolf broke its back, the pack simply abandoned it. Down in the settlements, soft townspeople looked at crippled folks with a sickening mix of pity and disgust, patting their own pockets in sheer relief. But Martha felt 0 pity. She looked at him with the exact same tired annoyance she gave her rusted backyard water pump when it needed an extra hard crank just to draw a drop. To this woman, he was just another broken piece of a broken homestead that demanded pure sweat to manage. The real turning point hit on the fourth evening. A fierce western summer storm rolled in, thunder violently rattling the cabin's thin, poorly glazed window panes. Martha had spent the entire day patching the flimsy roof on the chicken coop. She finally dragged herself inside, soaked to the bone, muddy and dead exhausted. Her hair was plastered flat to her round face, smelling faintly of wet chicken feathers and rich, damp frontier earth. She collapsed into the creaky wooden rocking chair beside the iron stove, peeling off mud-caked boots with a heavy groan. She never even glanced Colm's way. You know that exhaustion. She sat there, rubbing her thick, aching thighs, head back, eyes shut. Colm lay on that cot, his throat dry as dust. Right on the little stool beside him sat a tin cup of water Martha left hours ago. Let me tell you, he was sick of begging for things. Sick of waiting on her. He shifted his upper body, ignoring that fierce jolt of phantom pain shooting down his ruined spine. He stretched his thick, scarred fingers hard toward that stool. His rough fingertips just barely grazed the cup's edge. He reached further, chest lifting off the mattress, but without his legs to anchor him, his balance vanished. He pitched sideways, and his heavy hand smacked the tin. It tipped, tumbled, and clattered loud against those pine floorboards. Water splashed across the dusty wood and soaked right into his blanket. Colm froze, chest heaving, his weather-beaten face burning hot with sudden, violent shame. He squeezed his eyes tight, bracing for a harsh lecture. He waited for her to holler about being dead tired about scrubbing up his messes and about how absolutely useless he had become. He braced for the cruel lashing he figured was due. Martha opened her weary eyes. She stared at that spilled tin cup. She watched the puddle seeping into the floor. Then she looked straight at Colm, lying there rigid, defensive, and stripped bare of his frontier pride. She never yelled. She didn't sigh dramatically either. She just slowly pushed up from her rocking chair, her old knees popping loud in that dead quiet room. She wandered to the kitchen, grabbed a dry rag, and trudged right back. She knelt by his cot, the faded dress pulling tight across her broad hips. In pure silence, she soaked up that mess, wringing the rag into a bucket.
I tried to reach it.
Colm rasped his voice, sounding exactly like a cornered wolf's growl. Martha paused her work. She stared at his huge hands gripping the rough edge of that blanket. I know, she told him quietly. She stood tall, grabbed the cup, and poured fresh water from the pitcher over on the counter. She stepped back and held it out. Colm hesitated a long moment, then grabbed it, his rough knuckles brushing hers. Her skin felt rough, calloused, and deeply warm. You spill that one, you'll be licking it off the floorboards. She said it with a perfectly flat prairie drawl. Colm took a slow sip. For the first time since Amos hauled him out of that dusty wagon, the bitter defensive line of his mouth finally broke. A faint, barely noticeable huff of dark amusement escaped his nose. Fair enough, he muttered softly. Martha sank right back into her rocker. She didn't give him any tender gaze, and he sure didn't flash a charming smile. But as the heavy western rain lashed hard against the siding of that house, the silence between them wasn't strung with barbed wire anymore. It was just peaceful quiet. You and I know that feeling. Two battered survivors finally realizing they are in the same storm. By late September, those high plains shed their brutal heat, bringing in a biting, relentless wind that howled straight through gaps in the floorboards. Crisp mornings came heavily laced with frost, turning the dead prairie grass stiff and freezing up the iron water pump. For Martha, the bitter cold was a totally different kind of enemy. It settled deep in her bones, making her knees scream every time she hauled heavy firewood from the shed to the porch. She was steadily losing ground. The meager frontier harvest desperately needed bringing in. The root cellar had to be sorted, and the cabin roof patched before the snow really flew. She did the back-breaking work of 3 grown men, her thick frame moving with stubborn, relentless grit, but the homestead life was wearing her straight down to the bone. Colm watched it all from his iron cot, which Martha had pushed by the pot-bellied stove to keep him warm. He was starting to sit up for longer stretches, bracing his massive, weary shoulders against the log wall. That fierce fever had completely burned out of him, and the gaunt, hollowed-out look in his cheeks was slowly filling back in, thanks to Martha's thick, hearty stews. But as his raw strength came back, so did a gnawing, suffocating cabin fever. He was a wild man who lived his whole life moving. He had tracked elk across the jagged teeth of the Rockies and dragged iron traps right through freezing rivers. He built entire cabins bare-handed. Now you and I know how this eats a man alive. He was dead weight, relying on a woman working herself to death for them. That pure humiliation tasted like raw copper in the back of his throat. Their breaking point finally arrived on a bitter Tuesday evening. Martha came inside, face ruddy from the biting wind dragging the heavy leather harness of her one working mule. The main leather trace had completely snapped. Without that rig, she couldn't haul fallen deadwood from the creek bed to chop for winter fuel. She dropped the broken harness with a heavy thud, stripped her coat, and sank straight into her rocking chair. She stayed dead silent. Gather round and listen. She just fetched her dead husband's leather kit cracked canvas holding an awl, heavy waxed thread, and a rusted punch. She hauled that stiff hide into her lap to start working. Old Colm just watched her from the deep shadows. Her hands were thick and mighty strong, but mighty clumsy when it came to fine stitching. That hide was ancient, stiff as a barn door, fighting her like a wild bronc. She drove that awl against the stubborn hide. Her jaw locked tight, and a single drop of sweat rolled down her cheek, never mind the bitter draft in the cabin. Then the tool slipped. That sharp iron dug a nasty, bloody trench right across the meaty part of her thumb. Martha hissed out a breath and dropped it. She jammed her thumb into her apron, that rough cotton blooming fast with a dark, wet stain. She squeezed her eyes tight shut. For the first time, Colm saw her stiff, proud shoulders start to shake. It was not the pain. It was the bone-deep, crushing weariness of fighting a losing battle out on the prairie. "Bring it over here," Colm growled. His voice shattered that heavy quiet, rough as sandpaper. Martha snapped her eyes open, shooting daggers at him through the gloom. She held that bleeding hand tight to her chest. "I ain't got time for your barking tonight, mountain man. I gotta fix this or we freeze by December." I said bring it here. Colm leaned forward, thick cords of muscle popping on his neck. "You ain't got a clue how to stitch a harness. You pull that thread too tight, you just tear the hide. Plus, that awl is duller than a river rock." Martha just stared him down, chest heaving like a winded horse. She eyed her bloody thumb, then the ruined leather below. Her stubborn pride wanted him in hell. But survival out west is a mighty harsh master. She finally stood up, grabbed the rig and that canvas roll, and dumped the whole tangled mess right into his lap. "Fine," she snapped. "Do it. Show me how useless I am." Colm let the bitter words slide. He lifted that awl, rolling it over in his heavy, calloused hands. "Whetstone," he ordered. Martha fetched the sharpening stone from the butcher block. She handed it over, then stepped back, folding her arms across her chest to watch him like a hawk. Colm never even glanced up. He spat on that stone and set to putting a proper edge on the tool. The steady scrape and drag of steel on stone echoed through the room. His hands moved with a smooth, easy grace his crippled legs would never know again. You and I know that rhythm. It is the memory of 1,000 nights mending tack by a lonely campfire. Soon as the blade was keen, he grabbed hold of that stubborn hide. Where Martha had fought to grip it, Colm's thick forearms just muscled the heavy leather into submission. He punched every hole with dead, calm, measured force. Then he threaded that waxed cord, thick fingers moving like a master card cheat. He sewed up a double line, sinking those knots deep in the grain so they would not rub the mule raw on the trail. Martha just watched. The smell of raw hide, old grease, and wood smoke hung thick in the cabin. She saw the deadly focus in his pale eyes, the way his tight jaw finally softened while he worked. Right then, he was not a crippled man. He was a true craftsman in his element. Took him about an hour. When he finished, he just bit right through the heavy cord with his teeth. He tossed the patched harness onto the planks. That seam was flawless, tougher and cleaner than anything fresh from the store. There, Colm rasped out, dragging the back of his hand across his mouth. Martha scooped up the trace. She yanked on that mended joint with every ounce of strength. Didn't even budge. Solid as a rock. She ran her thumb along that perfect row of stitches. She looked over at Colm. He sat there waiting for a thank you, or maybe a quiet compliment. The mule collar has a rip in the lining, too, Martha said, cold and flat, hiding her hand. I will bring it in tomorrow. Do not think you are sleeping all day. Colm held her gaze, then let out a low, gritty rumble that might have been a laugh. He settled back against the log wall, folding his arms. Bring the saddle soap, too, he muttered. This whole cabin smells like wet hound, and your tack is an absolute disgrace. Martha just turned toward the kitchen to wrap her thumb. She never smiled, but that crushing weight in her chest eased up a fraction. You see, for the first time all winter, she wasn't carrying this homestead alone. November hit those plains like a blacksmith's swinging hammer. The sky bruised a permanent gray, wind carrying that metallic bite of deep snow. You see, Martha had rigged a heavy wooden chair, slapping on wheels scavenged from a rusted-out wheelbarrow. It was ugly, real heavy, and groaned like a dying ox, but it got Colm out of that parlor. Using his massive arms, he wheeled himself right out onto the porch, where he spent his daylight sharpening iron, patching tack, and splitting the heavy stove wood Martha hauled up. He sat there silent and brooding. But that wild, bleeding anger had cooled down into cold, focused utility. Mid-morning hit when a wagon finally crested that hill. Iron wheels chewed over the frozen ruts, loud and harsh in the biting, crisp air. Martha stood by the coop throwing cracked corn to the hens, breath puffing out in thick, white clouds. She stopped dead, leaning hard against the wooden handle of her bucket. It was Amos. He jerked those mules to a halt, swallowed up in a heavy buffalo coat over his bony frame. 2 riders flanked him, council members. The exact same cowards who voted to dump a crippled Colm right at her doorstep. They sat tall in their saddles, staring at the property, looking mighty surprised and severely disappointed. You and I know they expected pure ruin. Figured the widow was starving and the mountain man rotting in filth. Instead, that winter woodpile sat 10 feet high, squared perfectly. Barn roof patched up tight. Front porch swept clean. Amos climbed on down, boots crunching loud against the iced-over grass. He spat dark tobacco spit onto the frozen earth. Well now, Amos sneered, strutting toward her. Still breathing, Martha, and looking just as well-fed as ever. Told the council you would have eaten the stock by now. The 2 men just chuckled. Martha never even flinched. She squeezed that bucket, knuckles turning stark white. She felt that hot flush rising up. That old familiar shame and burning anger Amos always seemed to pull out. What do you want, Amos? She snapped. You are trespassing here. Trespassing? Amos laughed, taking a step. Unwashed wool and cheap sour mash whiskey just rolled off him. Technically, you owe the bank back taxes. Deadline hits tomorrow. We figured you lacked the silver, so we came to inventory. Find what we can auction to pay your debts. Martha felt her stomach hit the frozen ground. The fall harvest was miserable. She barely scraped up enough to survive winter, let alone pay taxes. She looked across her farm. The dirt. The deep struggle, the endless labor. It was her whole world. I have until tomorrow. Martha stepped forward, using her broad size to block that barn. Get off my land. Amos just sneered, reaching out and shoving her shoulder hard. Wasn't a killing push, but the frost was slick. Martha's heavy boots slid out, and she stumbled backward, losing her bucket. Yellow corn scattered right across the frozen dirt. Don't get uppity, fat girl, Amos hissed. You are just a squatter now. We are taking the mule, the tools, anything worth a damn. He took another greedy step forward. Thwack! The crack was sudden and violently loud. A bone-handled hunting knife buried deep into that coop post, vibrating like a rattler's tail. That steel blade sat exactly 2 inches from Amos's nose. Amos froze, solid eyes crossing, just to stare at that gleaming steel. Those two horseback riders instinctively grabbed for sidearms, their mounts dancing up nervously. Take another step toward her, and the next one goes through your throat. The voice was a low, guttural rumble, rising right out of the frozen earth itself. Amos turned his head slow. Sitting up on the porch, hidden by the overhang, was Colm. He leaned forward in that ragged chair. A heavy Sharps rifle rested casually across his ruined lap, finger resting real light on the trigger guard. His left hand gripped a second throwing knife, the steel catching that dull winter gray. Let me tell you, he did not look crippled. He looked like a cornered high-timber grizzly, pure, deadly apex predator. Those pale eyes locked onto Amos with a terrifying, entirely vacant calm. Zero bluff in that stare. It was the cold look of a man who had killed plenty, simply calculating wind resistance for his next deadly throw. You. Amos stammered out, taking a shaking step back from that vibrating knife. You're supposed to be dead. Not yet, Colm rasped. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. Pick up the bucket, Amos. The thug swallowed hard, glancing at his two hired guns for backup. Those riders sat dead still, hands frozen right above their holsters. They knew that old mountain man would drill one of them before a gun cleared leather. I ain't picking up no bucket for a dead-legged freak, Amos spat. He tried acting tough, but that voice of his shook. Colm slowly lifted the heavy barrel of his Sharps rifle. That cold iron scraped right along the wooden arm of his chair. He pulled back the hammer. That double click echoed like thunder in the freezing air. Pick up the bucket, Colm repeated. His voice was barely a whisper now. Fill it with the corn you spilled, or I will blow your leg off and let Martha use it to beat you dead. That silence stretched out tighter than barbed wire. Then, looking completely humiliated, Amos finally jerked forward and bent down. He grabbed that tin bucket. His hands trembled as he scooped up the spilled grain, scraping his freezing knuckles across the packed dirt. He stood back up and dropped the bucket near Martha's boots. We'll be back tomorrow, Amos muttered, too scared to look at Colm. With the sheriff. You ain't got the money. He scrambled right back into his wagon. Those two riders whipped their horses around, desperate to get away from the man on that porch. Amos lashed the mules, and the rig clattered hard down the trail, fading into the dust toward Red Creek. Martha stood in the yard, chest-heaving breath, smoking in the biting cold. She stared at that dirty corn, then glanced up at the porch. Colm uncocked his big rifle and rested it down. He leaned back. All that terrifying grit suddenly drained right out of his face, leaving the old-timer pale and dead tired. The burning phantom pain in his broken spine shot straight up his back, making his calloused hands shake as he hid the second blade. Martha walked slow over to the chicken coop, grabbed the knife stuck in the wooden post, and wrenched it free with a grunt. She wiped the steel clean on her apron and walked up to the porch. Now listen closely here. She stopped at the bottom steps, looking up. No thank yous spoken. Polite words were way too small for a frontier standoff like that. She offered the blade handle first. Colm took it, sliding the iron into the leather sheath strapped to his chair. He is right, Colm muttered quietly, his eyes fixed on those frozen western plains. They will be back tomorrow. Martha climbed the steps, her heavy boots thudding against the pine boards. She stood right beside him, staring at that same empty horizon. Then we figure it out, she said. She gave him no pity, and he gave her no shame in return. Just two survivors. The bitter wind howled around that farmhouse, but an unbreakable iron bond had settled right there on the porch. Inside, the kerosene lamp sputtered on the table, casting long, greasy shadows across the rough log walls. The sharp smell of burning oil filled the room, mixing with the stale stench of cheap boiled chicory. Martha sat hunched over a scrap of brown butcher paper, a dull pencil gripped tight in her calloused fingers. She scratched out another number. Her chest felt completely hollow. She had tallied absolutely everything. Sell the mule, and she could not haul wood. Sell the plow, and there would be no spring planting. If she hawked the seed corn, there would be no spring harvest at all. That greedy bank's tax paper laid on the table. a crisp white death warrant for her homestead. She stared at the debts until her vision blurred. The deep ache in her back throbbed right with her heartbeat. Then, from the dark parlor, a squeaky wheelchair broke the silence. Colm rolled himself right into the doorway. Those iron wheels ground hard against the floorboards. "Stop wearing holes in the paper," Colm muttered. His voice was rough as bark scraping through the quiet of the cabin. "You can't math your way out of an empty pocket." Martha didn't even look up. "Go to sleep, mountain man. I don't need your frontier philosophy tonight." "Bring me my coat." Martha finally stopped writing. "You and I both know that exhausted look." She turned her head, eyes dark and heavy in the lamplight. "Your old buckskin is in the rag barrel. I boiled it 3 times, and it still reeks of bear grease and blood." "Bring it here," he repeated, locking his eyes with hers. Martha hoisted herself from that chair with a heavy sigh, her tired knees popping. She dragged her boots to the kitchen, corner dug deep into a wooden barrel, and yanked out that stiff, ruined hide. She tossed it right onto Callum's lap. It slapped against his dead legs. Colm drew his skinning knife. That blade slid from its sheath with a quiet, deadly metallic whisper. Martha froze, her rough hands dropping. But Colm never even looked her way. He flipped that heavy coat over, revealing the thick, double-layered leather of the collar. He wedged the knife under the tough sinew stitching, slicing downward in one brutal, fluid motion. The stiff hide parted. He dug his thick fingers into the gap, pulling hard. A dark little pouch of oiled pigskin tumbled onto his lap. He picked it up, untied the leather cord, and dumped it over his palm. 3 heavy, jagged lumps of raw gold spilled out, gleaming dull in the lamplight. You and I know gold changes folks. Martha just stared at it. No gasping, no weeping with relief. Instead, a hot, ugly anger crawled up her neck, turning her face a dark red. "You had that," she breathed, her voice shaking with a sudden, violent fury. "Sewn in your coat this whole time while I fed you my rations, while I dragged a plow alone because our mule went lame. You let me bleed." Colm never flinched. He studied the gold, then her angry, flushed face. "I was paralyzed, Martha," he said, his gravelly voice completely empty of any apology. "A dead man dumped in strangers' dirt. If I showed this day one, you might have taken it, dragged me out back and left me for the coyotes, or paid Amos to do it. Up in the timber, you never show cash to a wolf until you know it won't bite." Martha stepped forward, her chest heaving hard. "I wiped you, fed you, didn't leave you to die." "I know," Colm said quietly. He held out his hand, that gold resting in his scarred palm. "That's why it's yours now. Room and board. Pay the tax man. Keep the change." Martha stared at his hand. The anger still burned, but she finally understood the man. "Stick with me here. He was a trapped, broken animal. Out west, trust just wasn't a given. It was currency he couldn't spend foolishly." She reached right out, snatching the raw nuggets from his palm. Her rough fingers brushed his. "I'm charging you interest," she snapped, turning her back so he wouldn't see the sudden traitorous tears in her eyes. By morning, the frost was thick enough to mimic light snow. Amos rolled up in a rented buggy, all bundled tight in a thick wool blanket, a smug sneer on his face. Beside him rode the county sheriff, a bored man with a red nose and a Winchester resting across his saddle pommel. Martha stood firm on that porch, arms crossed tight against the bitter, biting cold. Old Colm was nowhere to be seen. He'd rolled his chair into the dark parlor shadows, a loaded rifle resting across his dead legs, watching through a crack in the door. Amos never left the buggy. "Morning, Martha. Sheriff is here for the deed, or the inventory. Your pick." Martha walked down the wooden steps, heavy boots crunching on the frozen dirt. She reached into her apron pocket, pulled out a raw gold nugget, and simply tossed it. It hit Amos square in the chest, dropping to his lap with a heavy, undeniable thud. Amos scrambled to grab it, that arrogant sneer evaporating into a mask of pure shock. He held that gold to the gray morning light. The sheriff leaned over his saddle, his eyes gone wide. "That cover the taxes?" Martha said, her voice carrying across the freezing yard like the loud crack of a bullwhip. The assayer in town will weigh it. It'll cover this year, next year, and whatever phantom late fees you tried to invent. If there's change, keep it. Call it a fee to never drive up my dirt road again." Amos opened his jaw, but no sound came. He looked from the gold to Martha, completely unmoored. "We're squared, Amos." The sheriff grunted, tipping his dusty hat. "Have a good winter, Mrs. Higgins." You can bet Amos swallowed hard, hands shaking as he clutched that nugget. You and I know how these frontier tales start. He shot a toxic glare at the dark farmhouse, snapped the reins, and rode off. Martha just stood there, watching them disappear. That prairie wind bit hard at her face. Yet for the first time in 3 long years, she finally stopped feeling the crushing weight of that vast western sky pressing down on her. She simply turned around and headed up those wooden stairs. Come late January, the brutal plains were buried under 3 feet of solid, hard-packed snow. That winter wind screamed over the roofline in a deafening, never-ending howl. It violently rattled the glass, driving fine white powder straight through the gaps in the old timber siding. Inside that cabin, their entire world shrank to a 20-foot box of heat-potent smells and shared breath. The cast-iron stove roared, pumping out a dry, absolutely suffocating heat. That cramped space reeked heavily of rendered hog lard, wet wool, and the sharp, bitter tang of wood smoke. Frontier survival forced Martha and Colm into an orbit so suffocatingly tight they could hardly inhale without bumping elbows. But out here, a man like Colm adapts. He went and bolted heavy iron pulleys right into those ceiling timbers, dropping thick lengths of hemp rope straight down to his cot and his resting chair. Relying on his raw upper body strength, he could finally drag himself from that mattress to the chair without needing Martha to spot him. It was a brutal, sweaty chore that left his thick shoulders shaking. Still, he absolutely refused to let her carry his weight anymore. Martha spent her daylight hours processing the butchered hog she somehow managed to slaughter just before the deep freeze hit. The homestead chores were endless, greasy, and bone-tiring. It was late Tuesday. Outside, the blizzard was roaring with a fresh, violent fury. Martha stood right by the stove, a battered tin basin of scalding water resting on an old wooden crate. The woman was completely spent, her bones feeling heavy as lead. She turned her back to the room, figuring Colm was dead asleep on his cot. She slowly unbuttoned the front of her heavy calico dress, letting the thick fabric slip right down to her waist. Her broad, pale shoulders were already flushed a deep red from the stove's fierce heat. She plunged a rough linen rag into the boiling water, wrung it out tight, and slowly dragged it across the back of her stiff neck. She let out a long, heavy sigh as that blessed heat finally soaked straight into her aching muscles. She scrubbed her heavy chest and the thick rolls of her stomach, never trying to be gentle about it. Truth is, she hated her reflection. Her late husband had spent 10 solid years tearing her down, constantly reminding her she was built tough like a massive draft horse. He called her too wide, far too heavy, missing that delicate fragility men supposedly wanted. She aggressively scrubbed that lye soap against her skin, desperately trying to wash off the stench of hog fat and pure exhaustion. Then the slick bar slipped from her fingers. It hit the timber floorboards and skidded right under the iron frame of Colm's bed. Martha just groaned, sounding completely, utterly defeated. She bent her heavy thighs, pulling hard against her wool skirt, blindly reaching her hand underneath that iron cot. "You're going to pull a muscle in your back doing that." That sudden gravelly voice made Martha freeze up completely. She snapped upright, clutching the wet rag against her chest, her cheeks burning hotter than the iron stove. Colm was wide awake. The man was propped up on one elbow, blanket at his waist, revealing a bare chest, severely scarred and corded with thick muscle. He simply reached his long arm down and easily grabbed the soap off the floorboards. He didn't hand it right back, though. He just sat there, studying her. Martha felt completely and utterly exposed, sweaty, half undressed, and her hair a wild, damp tangle. She honestly wanted to fall straight through the cabin floorboards. She quickly crossed her thick arms over her chest defensively, her chin jutting out in her usual stubborn frontier defiance. "Close your eyes, mountain man," She snapped at him, though her voice shook a little. "It ain't a picture show." But Colm refused to look away. Those pale blue eyes tracked across her broad shoulders and the thick curve of her waist, taking in the solid, unyielding reality of her rugged frame. There was absolutely zero disgust in his gaze. No cruel, mocking humor either. "You fight your own shadow, Martha," Colm said in a quiet voice, holding out the soap. "Let's pause here." Martha hesitated, stepped forward and snatched the soap. But when she tried pulling away, Colm's thick, rough fingers firmly clamped around her wrist. His rugged grip was entirely firm, holding like a band of hot iron against her wet skin. She froze, her heart violently hammering against her ribs. "Let go of me," she ordered him, though her command lacked its usual sharp bite. "He told you that you were ugly, didn't he?" Colm asked softly, his rough thumb lightly brushing the frantic pulse beating at her trapped wrist. "Your husband?" Martha's throat tightened. The raw, brutal honesty of that question stripped away all her prairie defenses. "He told me I was built for pulling stumps. Picture this, friend." "Not for looking at," she whispered, old shame tasting bitter. Colm just let out a low, mocking snort. A weak man always resents a strong horse. He gave her wrist a gentle tug, pulling her a half-step nearer to that cot. The fever heat rolling off his skin tangled right up with the iron stove's fire. Down in the settlements, they like their women fragile. Colm remembered his voice, a dark rumble in that dead, quiet cabin. They prefer things that just break easy. Up in the high timber, fragile just gets you killed. You survive. You hold this whole roof up. He let go of her wrist, sliding his rough hand up to cup the solid curve of her hip right through that damp wool dress. This wasn't some gentle parlor romance. It was a claiming of her strength, a pure respect for her raw physical grit. "There ain't nothing ugly about a woman who can hold her ground," Colm told her, looking squarely into her eyes. Martha stared back down her chest, heaving with deep, heavy breaths. For the very first time, she didn't feel too big or awkward. She felt like a heavy iron anchor. She felt like the solid earth itself. Dropping the wet rag, it hit those floorboards with a soft slap, swallowed completely by the howling frontier wind outside. The morning after that soap fell, the cabin air felt thick, heavy, with a quiet, unspoken tension between them. Martha woke before dawn like she always did. She dressed in that bitter kitchen dark, her sturdy fingers fumbling with the stiff bone buttons on her heavy wool dress. She kept her eyes off the parlor. She just listened to the slow, steady rasp of Colm's breathing, a sound that had somehow become the very heartbeat of her lonely life. Her skin was still buzzing right where his rough, calloused palm had gripped her hip. It lingered there like a phantom burn. She buried that memory fast, drowning it out by violently rattling the iron stove grates and shoveling in a heavy load of fresh black coal. She figured he would speak up once he finally dragged his tired frame into his chair. A sly smirk, some remark, or fading back into his usual dark silence. Instead, he just rolled himself over to the kitchen table, grabbed his beat-up tin cup, and waited on the coffee. Neither one spoke a single word about it. "Now listen here, folks. You don't have the luxury to dissect feelings when snow buries the eaves and the wind howls a murder ballad against the glass." But their silence had shifted. It wasn't just the weary, dead stillness of two cornered wild animals anymore. They were sharing a bunker now. Come late February, the snow finally quit. But the real danger multiplied. A sudden, cruel spike in the weather brought down a heavy, freezing rain. It added hundreds of pounds of dense, wet ice to their roof. The whole mess started with a low, agonizing groan. Martha was working a tough ball of sourdough at the table. Colm sat by the hot stove, slowly honing a sharp skinning knife. That dreadful sound made them both freeze. It sure wasn't the wind. It was the deep, structural holler of old cabin timber finally hitting its absolute breaking point. Crack. That noise rang out sharp as a gunshot. A fine mist of sawdust and dried pine bark drifted right down from the ceiling, settling quietly onto that kitchen table. Martha snapped her head straight up. That main load-bearing beam, a massive stripped pine log running the full length of the parlor, was bowing down hard, dead center in the wood. A jagged black splinter had cracked wide open. The crushing weight of that ice was snapping the whole house clean in half.
"Get away from the table!"
Colm barked, his voice cracking like a bullwhip. Martha didn't dare argue. She backed away fast, wiping flour off onto her apron. Another sickening groan tore right through the room. The heavy beam dipped another inch. The window frames shrieked as the walls took on all that displaced weight.
"It's going to cave,"
Martha breathed, all the color draining straight from her round face. If that roof gave way, the impact wouldn't kill them. They'd just freeze to death in those ruins before sunrise. The root cellar. Colm ordered, his wild eyes frantically scanning the cracking ceiling. There's a 6x6 oak post down there. We use it to brace the floorboards. Go fetch it. Martha ran hard. She ripped open the heavy kitchen trapdoor, practically throwing herself down those narrow wooden steps into the freezing, earthy dark of the root cellar. She found that massive oak timber buried deep underneath a pile of old, empty burlap sacks. It was incredibly dense, freezing cold, and weighed 100 pounds. What do you and I learn from the frontier? Grit. She hauled it up with a guttural scream, bark tearing skin straight off her knuckles. Picture this. She dragged that timber across the kitchen floorboards, chest heaving, sweat pouring down her face. "Here," she gasped, rolling the heavy timber toward Colm. "Stand it up." He wheeled his chair right under that splintering roof beam. "I'll guide the top, you wedge the bottom," he ordered. "Colm, if that beam snaps while you're under it." "Stand it up, Martha." She gripped that post, planted her boots firm, and heaved. Her broad shoulders screamed out in pure agony. She walked it, upright legs shaking under that immense, crushing weight. Colm reached up, his massive arms corded with thick muscle from dragging his own paralyzed weight around, clamped onto that rough oak. "Push it," he grunted out, teeth bared like a cornered wolf in pure, desperate strain. Martha threw her entire body weight against the base of that oak post, sliding it across the floorboards right under the fracture. But hell, it was 2 inches too short to reach that sagging roof beam. "It needs a wedge." Colm hollered over another terrifying crack echoing from the ceiling. He held that heavy timber vertical, his biceps bulging hard, his face flushed a dark, angry red. Martha scrambled over to the stove's woodpile. She grabbed a thick chunk of split hickory and the heavy iron maul used for chopping kindling. She threw herself onto her knees right beside Colm's chair. "Lift it!" she hollered. Colm didn't argue. He wrapped his arms around that oak, took a deep, ragged breath, and drove it upward. The man wasn't just lifting a post. He was trying to push the very roof of their homestead back up. The veins in his neck bulged out like thick blue ropes. A raw, wild roar ripped from his throat as he forced that heavy timber up by just a fraction of an inch. Martha didn't blink. She shoved that hickory wedge right under the post and took a massive swing with her iron maul. Clang! The hammer struck true. That post wedged tight against the ceiling. Colm held the crushing weight, his arms violently shaking, his wheelchair's leather grips groaning loud as the heavy counterpressure forced his paralyzed legs downward. Clang! Martha took another swing, driving that hickory wedge deeper. The awful splintering stopped. The sagging roof beam settled heavily onto the flat top of that oak. Colm let go, arms dropping like anvils. He slumped back in that chair, gasping for breath, chest heaving like a run-down horse. Martha dropped the hammer. She stayed kneeling, resting her forehead against the rough bark of that braced timber. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped wild bird. The old homestead fell completely silent, except for the howling wind. The heavy beam held. Slowly, Martha turned her head. Colm was staring back. His face was pale, sweat dripping from his jawline. Every inch of distance between them had just vanished. Her trembling hand reached out, pressing bleeding knuckles against the rough wool of his trousers right above his paralyzed knee. Not a single word spoken. She just anchored herself to his strength. Colm covered her hand with his own, his grip tight, calloused, and fiercely unyielding. Let me tell you, they sat there holding up that roof together. April brought the thaw, and it was a violent, ugly resurrection. The snow didn't fade gracefully. It just rotted. Those pristine white fields turned into a sucking, treacherous bog of deep black mud and standing water. The air smelled like wet earth, rotting prairie grass, and harsh sunlight. Creeks swelled over their banks, roaring with a muddy fury that tore out dead brush and dragged it downstream. For the first time in 5 months, that farmhouse door stayed wide open. Martha stood out on the porch holding a tin cup of water in her hand, squinting against the blinding glare of the sun bouncing off those muddy puddles. She looked thinner. The brutal winter had burned away her bulk, leaving her shoulders harder, her jawline chiseled like stone. But she was still a formidable, solid woman. She watched the fields. 50 yards out, Colm was down in the mud. He wasn't in his wheelchair. Those heavy iron wheels would have sunk right to the axles in that muck. Instead, the man engineered a low, flat sled from smooth pine boards, curved up at the front like a toboggan. Strapped to it at the waist, his paralyzed legs rested flat behind him. He was out there clearing the lower 40. You and I know true grit when we see it. Hands wrapped in leather rags, dragging himself like a wounded bear. Slow, deliberate, undeniably powerful. He reached a massive, half-buried fieldstone that the bitter frost heaves had pushed up during the long winter. Martha just watched him dig bare hands right into that freezing frontier mud. He wrapped thick iron links around that rock base. Never asked for the mule. A beast like that would just snap an ankle in this heavy muck. Colm grabbed the chain's far end, driving his elbows deep into the bitter earth. Braced that massive chest, and hauled. The earth fought back, a thick, wet squelch echoing straight across the homestead. He let out a low grunt. Arm muscles corded up tight right through his sweat-drenched flannel shirt. The boulder gave way. Another hard yank, a sharp hiss of breath, and he tore that stone right out of the dirt. He dragged it onto the sled, dropped the iron, and started hauling his own weight toward the rock pile sitting on the property line. The man was caked in black muck, face completely smeared, his ragged clothes soaked down to the bone. He looked like a wild beast. Martha stepped off the porch, her leather boots sinking 2 inches right into the sludge. She didn't blink. She marched right into the field. Her dress hem dragged through the wet dirt, drinking up that freezing water. Colm finally stopped as she got close. He let his chin hit his chest heaving. His breath made faint white clouds in that cold spring air. He peered up at her, swiping dark mud off his brow with the back of one filthy, calloused wrist. "You're making a real mess of your dress, Martha." He rasped out, a tired grin on his mouth. Martha passed him a tin cup. "And you're making a total spectacle of yourself, mountain man. Keep dragging boulders like that and you're bound to rip a shoulder clean out of its socket." Colm took that old cup and killed it in one long gulp. He handed it back, fingers brushing hers. The soil on his rough skin felt gritty and freezing. "Better my shoulder than your back. This dirt needs turning. We have seed to put down." He said we, not you. Martha just looked out toward the wagon trail. You and I know wagons are mighty rare this early in the season. She spotted Amos Higgins driving the buckboard. He slowed his mules down, staring wide-eyed right at their fields. He was gawking at the heavy widow and a busted mountain man working the deep muck like 2 plain draft animals. Amos didn't pull the brakes, didn't shout a single insult. He just whipped those mules and bolted down the trail looking completely spooked. "He figured we'd be dead," Martha muttered, watching the rig crest the ridge. Folks like Amos always bet on the harsh winter to do their killing. Colm answered back, slowly unhooking his heavy canteen from the side of the sled. They forget the freeze takes out the weak, not the stubborn. Martha just stared down at the man. By any city folk's standard, he was a ruined man. His legs were dead weight, wearing pure rags, dragging himself through the muck. But when that spring sun caught his face, showing off the hard, unyielding lines of his jaw, and the fierce, sharp wit in those pale eyes, she knew he was the most magnificent sight she'd ever witnessed. He didn't have those bitter, cowardly eyes of her late husband. He looked at her like an equal, a true partner in the dirt. Martha dropped to her knees in the mud. Didn't care about the freezing water soaking her wool stockings. She grabbed hold of that heavy chain rigged to the sled's rock. "What are you doing?" Colm asked, his thick brow furrowing. "You pull the sled," Martha told him, her voice rock steady. "I'll pull the chain. We'll move twice as fast. Sun is wasting." Colm just stared at her. The prairie wind caught a damp lock of her hair, whipping it right across her mud-splattered cheek. Now, you and I know a genuine smile when we see one. His eyes held no warmth, just a deep, terrifying, frontier respect. "All right, Martha," he grunted, digging those elbows straight back into the muck. "Pull!" They labored until the sun sank below the ridge, painting the western sky a bruised purple. Neither spoke. The only sounds out there were sucking mud and the heavy clinking of forged iron, and the ragged, matched breathing of two damaged survivors refusing to surrender 1 inch of their homestead. When October finally rolled in, its sharp, cloudless sky turned that prairie grass into a sea of brittle gold. Let's step back in time. The morning frontier air held that sharp bite of wood smoke and dry cured corn. That heavy pioneer wagon just groaned its iron-rimmed wheels, carving deep parallel ruts right into the packed dirt road heading toward Red Creek. Piled high it was. Burlap sacks of winter wheat, crates of hard squash, and thick bundles of cured tobacco, stacked with brutal, dead-on precision. Martha sat tall on the right side of that buckboard. She wore a brand-new, plain dark brown wool dress, the thick fabric stretching comfortably across her broad pioneer shoulders and wide waist. She gripped those leather reins with hands forever stained by prairie dirt, calloused, thick, and rough as old tree bark. Beside her rode Colm. He sure didn't sit in the back like regular cargo. He spent 2 late summer weeks fixing up that wagon seat, bolting heavy iron and a thick leather harness right to the wooden bench. That rig kept his massive torso sitting perfectly upright. Wearing a clean oilcloth duster, his icy blue eyes tracked the western horizon from under the wide brim of a beaten Stetson hat. He looked massive, absolutely immovable. They rattled across the wooden bridge into town, mule hooves echoing a hollow beat against the dry creek bed below. Red Creek hadn't changed a bit. Those old false front buildings still leaned against the endless wind, and the boardwalks stayed warped from the brutal sun. But as Martha's homestead wagon rolled right down the middle of that muddy street, a thick, heavy silence rolled out ahead of them. Men out on the boardwalk completely stopped chewing their tobacco. Women leaving the mercantile froze, hands hovering right over their woven goods baskets. You and I know what they remembered. That paralyzed, dying mountain man they tossed into a struggling widow's wagon over a year back. Folks in town expected a double funeral before the spring thaw. Instead, they were staring down a rugged frontier fortress on wheels. Martha halted those mules outside the assayer and general store. The heavy brake lever squealed out a harsh, bitter sound that made half the town flinch. Now Amos Higgins was slouched on a barrel outside the saloon across the dusty street. The man looked drawn, his face flushed red with cheap whiskey, clothes just hanging right off his bony frame. He stared open-mouthed at the rig. He looked from those premium homestead crops to the terrifying, straight-backed mountain man he once dragged out by the collar. Colm didn't even sneer at Amos. He flat-out ignored him. To Colm, Amos was just cheap wind blowing dust around. Completely irrelevant. The shopkeeper, a balding fella named Miller, stepped nervously onto the wooden boardwalk, wiping his trembling hands down his work apron. He looked up at Martha, then flicked his scared eyes over to Colm, swallowing hard. "Morning, Mrs. Higgins," Miller mumbled, his voice completely stripped of its usual snobby condescension. "That is a mighty heavy harvest you got there." "It is winter surplus," Martha replied, her flat voice, holding the heavy authority of a frontier woman who pulled raw stones from frozen mud. 300 weight in wheat, 50 squash, and solid tobacco. I want hard silver for it, Miller. No cheap banknotes. No store credit." Miller nodded, fast-stepping right down into the mud to inspect that winter wheat. He untied a heavy burlap sack, plunging his bare hand deep into the grain. Pulling it out, his eyes went wide. It was perfectly dry golden and clean of any chaff. "I will fetch the scales," Miller muttered, practically sprinting back inside. It took a solid hour to unload. That frontier town watched in absolute shock as Martha hoisted heavy grain sacks onto her shoulder, thick boots planted firmly, breathing steady. Colm handled the inventory from the wagon seat, his deep, rumbling voice barking out exact weights and tallies, demanding a fair, honest count down to the final ounce. When a young farmhand reached up to adjust Colm's heavy harness, thinking the man was stuck, Colm's massive hand shot out. He wrapped the boy's wrist fast as a striking rattlesnake. "I am seated just fine, son," Colm rasped out, releasing the boy, who quickly scrambled backward in pure terror. When the final trade was done, Martha climbed back up onto that buckboard. A heavy canvas pouch packed with silver coins hit her lap with a mighty satisfying thud. She never even smiled. She just popped the heavy brake lever and clicked her tongue at those mules. The rig slowly turned around, leaving that frontier town in a stunned, humiliated silence. They didn't say a word heading home. You and I know the plains don't care. The sun just set bleeding, bruised purples across the indifferent frontier. The evening wind cut sharp and cold. By the time they hit the farmhouse, shadows stretched long. Martha unhitched the mules. Her muscles screamed with that familiar deep ache of a brutal day's work. She stepped onto the porch. Colm had already dropped himself into his iron chair using those heavy ceiling pulleys. Martha sank down heavy on the wooden steps, resting both elbows on her thick knees. She dug a canvas pouch from her pocket and dropped it right on the floorboards between them. "That buys seed for next year," Martha said, real quiet, staring out at the pitch-black fields. "And enough coal to burn until April." Colm rolled his chair closer to those iron wheels, squeaking softly. He eyed that pouch, then looked at the sweat-soaked hair escaping the tight bun on the back of Martha's neck. He reached down. Now his big, scarred hands didn't offer any gentle touch. Instead, those thick fingers wrapped firm around her shoulder, squeezing with a heavy, undeniable kind of pressure. It was a man anchoring himself to the strongest thing in his world. "We built a good winter, Martha," Colm murmured a low rumble in the dusk. Martha shut her eyes. She felt his rough calluses right through her wool dress. She didn't feel heavy anymore. She didn't feel cast aside. She covered his big hand with her own, thick fingers matching his iron grip perfectly. "Yes, we did, mountain man," she breathed. They sat there while night swallowed the plains. "Look closely with me now." Two scarred souls the world tried throwing away, completely content in this dirt empire they conquered together. The Old West was never tamed by pretty or fragile folks. It was broken by the stubborn and the discarded folks who flat out refused to die. Martha and Colm did more than survive that town's cruel joke. They buried it under grit, sweat, and raw iron. Now, if this raw tale of an unapologetic, hard-earned romance struck a chord, hit that like button and share it with folks who understand true Western resilience. Subscribe and ring the bell. Join me for more gritty human stories straight from the untamed frontier.